Hello, and welcome. Find that perfect position in your bed, the one where your body feels most at ease. Let your muscles soften, your shoulders drop, and your jaw unclench. Allow the noise and the glare of the modern world to dissolve, replaced by the gentle, flickering glow of a single candle in a quiet room. As you breathe in, imagine the air is filled with the faint, sweet scent of old parchment, dried lavender, and beeswax. As you breathe out, let go of the day's anxieties, releasing them like dandelion seeds to the wind. Tonight, we are not concerned with the urgent or the immediate. We are taking a slow and soothing journey back in time, not to witness the clash of swords or the crowning of kings, but to sit by the hearth of the medieval home. Our path is lit by firelight, and our destination is the heart of a 14th century life, where we will explore one of its most fundamental and fascinating arrangements, the marriage market. In this quiet exploration, we will uncover how a young woman's life was charted, not by the compass of her own heart, but by the careful calculations of dowries, alliances, and survival. So close your eyes, quiet your thoughts, and let the whispers of the past become your gentle, lulling guide into a deep and restorative rest. Imagine a world where your future is a commodity, your name a line item in a ledger, and your marriage a merger. In the 1300s, this was not a dystopian fantasy. It was the bedrock of society. Marriage was rarely a private affair of the heart. It was the most significant economic and social contract a person would ever enter, and its negotiation was a matter of grave and sober importance. For every stratum of society, from the serf tied to his lord's land to the duke ruling over a vast domain, marriage was a tool. For the great noble houses, it was the ultimate instrument of statecraft. A daughter, particularly an heiress, was not simply a child to be loved. She was a political asset, a living treaty, a key that could unlock greater power and prestige. Her union could pacify a rebellious border, absorb a rival's territory, or forge an alliance so powerful it could alter the map of Christendom. The personal happiness of the bride and groom was a pleasant but entirely secondary consideration. For the peasantry, who constituted the overwhelming majority of the population, the calculus was different, but no less critical. Their world was one of subsistence, where the margin between survival and starvation was perilously thin. Here, marriage was a partnership for labor. A farmer with too many sons and not enough land to divide would seek a match for one with the daughter of a neighbor whose fields lay fallow for want of strong hands. A village blacksmith needed a wife not only to bear children but to manage the household, tend the crucial kitchen garden, and perhaps even work the bellows in the forge. In this world, a strong back was more comely than a pretty face, and a reputation for being a hard worker was a woman's most prized virtue. The entire system pivoted on a single crucial element, the dowry. A dowry was the wealth in coin, land, livestock, or valuable goods that a bride brought with her into the marriage. It was, in effect, her portion of the family inheritance, paid in advance. The dowry was a family's public declaration of its own worth and a direct investment in their daughter's future. Let us imagine a merchant's daughter in the bustling city of Bruges in the year 1350. Her name is Alara, and she is 14. For years, her mother has been meticulously adding to her dowry chest. It is not just a collection of items. It is a curated portfolio of her value. Inside, nestled amongst layers of linen, are bolts of fine woolen cloth from Flanders, a silver girdle, a brass cauldron, and perhaps a small illuminated prayer book. Her father, a member of the cloth guild, has promised a purse of 30 silver florins, and more importantly, a share in a future trading voyage to Genoa. This dowry is not a mere wedding gift. It is the seed capital for her new life. It will be used by her husband to expand his business, to buy a larger house with a shop front, or to secure his own position within the city's powerful guilds. Alara's future security, her social standing, and the comfort of her children are all woven into the fabric and counted in the coins of that dowry. For a highborn lady, the dowry was a matter of state. It might be a castle overlooking the Rhine, the annual revenues from 100 villages, or a politically charged claim to a foreign throne. The negotiations would be conducted not over a mug of ale, but through Latin correspondence carried by envoys who traveled for months across bandit-infested roads. The fate of nations could hang on the precise wording of a dowry clause. In this marketplace of matrimony, a woman's worth was appraised, catalogued, and bargained for with the cool deliberation of a master chess player. To our modern minds, the concept is jarring, but in the 14th century, childhood was a brief, unsentimental season. The church's canon law stipulated the minimum age for a legally binding marriage, 12 for girls and 14 for boys. This was not an arbitrary number. It was tied to the age of puberty, the biological threshold at which a person was deemed capable of fulfilling the primary purpose of marriage, procreation. For the aristocracy, the journey to the altar began much earlier. Picture a great stone hall, its walls softened by tapestries depicting heroic hunts. A feast is in progress. At the high table, a powerful baron sits with his 5-year-old daughter, Isabel. She is a miniature adult, encased in a gown of heavy damask, her hair tightly braided. Across the hall, another lord sits with his 7-year-old son. The two fathers, their negotiations complete, raise their goblets in a toast. A deal is struck. Their children are now formally betrothed. Isabel's life is now set upon a fixed course. She has no more say in her future husband than a field has in the crop that is sown in it. Her education will now be tailored specifically for her future role. It is a curriculum of submission and management. She will learn to embroider intricate patterns, to play a lute, to read just enough to manage household accounts, and, most importantly, to recognize the complex heraldry of allied and enemy houses. She is being groomed to be the chatelaine of a great castle, the manager of a vast domestic enterprise, and the mother of a legitimate heir. Why this urgency? Life in the 1300s was a fragile and fleeting affair. A chill of precariousness hung in the air. The Black Death had swept through Europe just a few years prior, and subsequent waves of plague, famine, and the ever-present dangers of childbirth meant that life expectancy was brutally short. A nobleman could not afford the luxury of waiting. To die before his daughter was safely married was to leave a valuable asset unsecured, potentially plunging his house into chaos. Among the peasantry, the timeline was different. While the law permitted marriage at 12, most commoners married later, often in their late teens or early 20s. The reason was starkly economic. A young man had to be able to support a family. He needed to wait until he inherited his father's strip of land, saved enough to rent his own, or completed a long apprenticeship to become a master craftsman. A young peasant couple had to be a viable economic unit from the moment they were wed. There was no family treasury to cushion them. So, while a noble girl's childhood was truncated by a formal contract, a peasant girl's childhood simply bled into a life of work. Her education was in the fields, the kitchen, and at the spinning wheel. Her marriage would still be arranged by her parents, but it would likely be to a boy from her own village, someone whose family she knew, whose reputation was common knowledge. There was a greater chance for a quiet, familiar affection to form the backdrop of the arrangement, but the engine driving it was still the relentless, grinding need for survival. The arrangement of a marriage was a delicate negotiation, and the chief negotiators were the fathers. A father's authority over his children was nearly absolute. It was his sacred duty, and his legal right to dispose of them in marriage as he saw fit. Let us drift again into that smoky village tavern. The two farmers, Thomas and William, lean closer. The ale is a social lubricant, but the business is serious. Thomas speaks of his son, John. He can plow a furrow straighter than any man in the parish, and he doesn't shy from the hard work of the harvest. William nods, taking a slow sip. My Agnes, he replies, can spin a pound of wool in a day. Her butter is sought after at the market, and she has her mother's skill with healing herbs. She will bring to the marriage 3 good ewes, a feather bed, and our second best cooking pot. The haggling is nuanced. It's about more than just assets. It's about character and connection. The south field John will inherit, Thomas adds, borders your own west pasture. The union would make a fine single holding. This is the heart of the matter. The joining of lands, the consolidation of family efforts. When they are satisfied, they clasp hands. The rough, calloused grip is as binding as any written contract. John and Agnes, who might be working in the fields unaware of the transaction, have just had their futures decided. Their obedience is not questioned, it is assumed. For the aristocracy, the process was magnified in scale and complexity. Fathers relied on a network of agents, shrewd lawyers, high-ranking clergymen, and trusted family retainers. These men were the original private investigators. They would travel to a foreign court on a diplomatic mission with the secret task of vetting a potential bride. Their checklist was extensive. They would scrutinize the family's lineage for any hint of madness, infertility, or political disgrace. They would assess the dowry, ensuring the promised lands were not barren swampland and the titles were not empty honors. And then came the most delicate part, the physical assessment. Emissaries, or trusted ladies-in-waiting, might be dispatched to discreetly observe the young lady. They were tasked to check for clear skin, a full set of straight teeth, sweet breath, and a graceful bearing. And, most importantly, they would note the width of her hips, seen as a clear indicator of her childbearing potential. Often, the first introduction was through a portrait. A king or a duke would receive a small, exquisitely painted likeness of a potential bride from a distant land. He would study the face of the stranger, a face rendered by an artist who was likely paid to be flattering. The story of Henry VIII of England, recoiling from the real-life Anne of Cleves after falling for her flattering portrait, is a famous example of the perils of this practice. Imagine the strange, detached intimacy of that moment. A prince holding the fate of his dynasty in his hands, basing his decision on a panel of painted wood and the carefully worded reports of his envoys. In this highly structured world of practical arrangements, where did love fit in? The simple answer is, it didn't. Or rather, the kind of romantic love we prize was relegated to the realm of art and fantasy. This was the age of courtly love, a highly stylized and elaborate code of conduct, celebrated in the songs of troubadours and the epic poems of writers like Chrétien de Troyes. These tales were filled with knights performing breathtaking deeds of valor, not for their wives, but for the love of a beautiful, noble, and almost always unattainable lady who was, crucially, married to someone else. Courtly love was a sophisticated game for the aristocracy, a way to sublimate desire into art. It was a parallel universe that rarely, if ever, intersected with the reality of marriage. To expect to fall in love with your spouse was seen as naive, even foolish. Theologians and moralists of the day argued that the love within a marriage should be a calm, dutiful, and temperate affection, caritas, not the fiery, irrational passion, amor of the poets. Passion was considered a disruptive force, a form of madness that threatened the stability and order that marriage was designed to uphold. And yet, the human heart is not so easily legislated. We must not imagine these people as unfeeling automatons. Within the rigid confines of arranged marriages, genuine affection could and did grow. A husband and wife, bound together by duty and shared experience, could develop a deep companionship and a quiet, abiding respect. A shared joke, the birth of a child, the successful navigation of a harvest, or a harsh winter, these were the small bricks with which a foundation of mutual care could be built. And sometimes, romance did find a way to bloom in the cracks. A stolen glance across a crowded hall, a secret message passed through a trusted servant, a line of poetry copied and slipped into a prayer book. We have a precious glimpse of this in the famous Paston letters from 15th century England, where Marjorie Bruce wrote to her fiancé, John Paston, referring to him as her right well-beloved Valentine. It is a rare and beautiful testament that even in a world of arrangements, the human desire for a chosen, romantic connection could not be entirely extinguished, but it was the exception, not the rule. For most, love was a fortunate accident, a welcome bonus, but never the prerequisite. As the Middle Ages matured, the Church wove itself ever more deeply into the fabric of marriage. It sought to elevate the union from a private, secular contract into a public, sacred sacrament under its authority. To combat the endemic problem of clandestine marriages, which created legal chaos over inheritance and legitimacy, the Church mandated the publishing of the banns. For 3 consecutive Sundays, the priest would announce the intended marriage from the pulpit. This was a public call for objections. Did anyone know if the groom was already married to a woman in another village? Were the bride and groom related within the forbidden degrees of kinship? These rules on kinship, or consanguinity, were astonishingly complex. For a long period, the Church forbade marriage between relatives up to the 7th degree of kinship, essentially sharing a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. For the tightly interwoven European nobility, this made finding an eligible, unrelated spouse nearly impossible. It also provided a convenient loophole. A king wishing to discard a wife could often discover a distant, forgotten common ancestor, petition the Pope for an annulment, and be free to make a more politically advantageous match. The wedding ceremony itself was a public spectacle, deliberately staged for the community to witness. It took place not at the high altar, but in facie ecclesiae at the face of the church, on the porch or steps. Here, in the open air, the priest would ask the essential question of both bride and groom. Did they consent? This principle of consent was, in theory, the absolute core of a valid Christian marriage. A forced marriage was no marriage at all, but the gap between theory and practice could be immense. How freely could a young girl, standing before her stern-faced father, her expectant new family, and the watchful eyes of the entire village, truly refuse? The pressure was unspoken but overwhelming. To say no was to bring catastrophic shame upon her family. So, while the Church championed free will, it often tacitly accepted the reality of familial coercion. After the vows, the groom would place a ring on the 4th finger of his bride's right hand. The ceremony would be followed by a nuptial mass inside the church, and then, for those with the means, a wedding feast. This was not just a party, it was a political act. The sharing of food and drink with the community sealed the union in the public consciousness. Following the feast, for the nobility, came the final, crucial ritual, the public bedding. The couple would be escorted to their bedchamber by family and honored guests, blessed by a priest, and tucked into bed together. This was not a prurient spectacle, but a final solemn confirmation of the union's legitimacy, ensuring there could be no doubt that the marriage was consummated and the path to producing an heir was open. Once the vows were spoken and the feast was consumed, the true work of marriage began. And for a woman, that work had one all-consuming purpose: to produce children, specifically to produce a male heir. The entire structure of alliance and inheritance, the very reason for her marriage, rested on her fertility. From the moment she entered her husband's home, a silent watch began. Every month that passed without a sign of pregnancy would increase the pressure, the whispered anxieties of her new family, and her own quiet fears. Her value as a wife, her security within the household, was inextricably tied to her womb. A barren wife was seen as a failure, a broken vessel. In the eyes of both the church and society, she was failing in her sacred duty. The fault was almost universally laid at her feet. If a couple remained childless, it was the wife who was considered barren, not the husband sterile. Imagine our young noblewoman, Isabel, now married and living in her husband's cold, unfamiliar castle. She is surrounded by his family, stern mother-in-law, suspicious sisters, all of them watching her, waiting. Her days are a mixture of prayer and folk medicine. She might make a pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint known to aid conception, like Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary. She would be given herbal concoctions by the castle's wise woman, foul-tasting brews of mugwort and mandrake, meant to stir the humors and make her fertile. She might be instructed to wear special amulets or to time her marital duties according to the phases of the moon. The pressure on her husband was also immense. His own masculinity and the continuation of his lineage were at stake. But for Isabel, the burden was existential. If she failed to conceive, she risked being repudiated, set aside in favor of a new, hopefully more fruitful, wife. And then, when pregnancy finally came, the fear did not subside. It simply changed its shape. Childbirth in the 14th century was a woman's battlefield. It was a time of immense danger, a doorway that many women passed through only to find death on the other side. Before going into labor, a sensible woman, noble or peasant, would confess her sins to a priest and make her will. The birthing chamber itself was an exclusively female domain. The husband and all other men were banished. The room would be sealed, windows covered to keep out drafts and evil spirits, and a great fire would be roaring in the hearth, regardless of the season. Surrounded by her mother, sisters, and a local midwife, the laboring woman entered a world of pain, prayer, and ritual. The midwife, an experienced but often uneducated practitioner, would use a combination of practical knowledge and superstitious rites to ease the delivery. Holy relics might be placed on the woman's belly, and sacred girdles, believed to have been worn by the Virgin Mary, were sometimes loaned out by churches to wealthy patrons to aid in a difficult birth. The moment of birth was one of supreme tension, followed either by profound relief or devastating tragedy. If both mother and child survived, the next critical question was the baby's gender. The birth of a healthy son was cause for wild celebration. Bells would ring, a feast would be declared, and the father would be congratulated on securing his line. An heir had been born. A daughter, while still a blessing, was often a quiet disappointment. She was another mouth to feed, another dowry to be raised, another pawn for a future negotiation. The best that could be hoped for was that she would be healthy and marriageable. In the cold arithmetic of dynasty, the goal was always an heir and, if possible, a spare, a second son, as insurance against the fragility of life. What happened when these carefully constructed unions, these pillars of social and economic order, began to crumble? The medieval world had no concept of divorce in the modern sensea legal dissolution of a valid marriage. A true marriage, blessed by God, was considered indissoluble. But there were ways out, paths that ranged from the legally complex to the socially ruinous. For the wealthy and powerful, the primary escape route was the annulment. An annulment was not a divorce. It was a legal and theological declaration that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. It was a way of wiping the slate clean. The most common grounds were a pre-existing contract to marry someone else, the inability to consummate the union, or, most usefully, the discovery that the couple was related within the Church's forbidden degrees of kinship, consanguinity. This last reason was a powerful political tool. Given the tangled family trees of the European nobility, a determined lawyer could almost always find a shared great-great-grandparent if he looked hard enough. A famous example is the annulment of the marriage between King Louis VII of France and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. After 15 years and 2 daughters, their union was dissolved on the grounds of consanguinity. It was a polite fiction. The real reasons were political friction and Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir. Within weeks, Eleanor married the young Henry Plantagenet, who would become King Henry II of England, transferring her vast lands from French to English control and setting the stage for centuries of conflict. Annulment was a game for kings and popes, a costly and complex process far beyond the reach of any commoner. For the peasant or the artisan, whose marriage soured into misery or violence, the options were far grimmer. The church courts might grant a separation from bed and board in extreme cases of life-threatening cruelty or proven adultery. This allowed the couple to live apart, but it did not break the marital bond. They were still husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law, and neither was free to remarry. It was a state of permanent legal and social limbo. The greatest threat to a marriage contract, however, was adultery, and here, the double standard was absolute. A husband's infidelity, while a sin, was often treated with a social shrug. It did not threaten the legal line of inheritance. A wife's adultery, however, was a crime of catastrophic proportions. It was seen not just as a personal betrayal, but as a direct attack on the patriarchal order, a form of treason against the family. It raised the terrifying possibility of a cuckoo in the nest, a bastard child who might illegitimately inherit the family name, property, and titles. The punishment for an adulterous woman could be brutal in public. She might be stripped, her hair shorn, and paraded through the streets to be jeered at and pelted with filth. Her dowry could be confiscated, and she could be cast out of her home in total disgrace. Her lover could also face severe punishment, including fines, mutilation, or even death. Yet, despite the immense social pressure and the dire consequences of failure, some people still chose to defy the system. Clandestine marriages and elopements, while risky, did happen. Driven by genuine affection or a desperate desire to escape an arranged match, a young couple might find a renegade priest or simply exchange vows with each other in private. This was the ultimate rebellion, the assertion that their own consent, their own love, was more important than the contracts of their fathers. It was a dangerous gamble that could lead to disinheritance and social ostracism, but it is a poignant reminder that even in the most rigid of societies, the human heart sometimes demands to write its own story. In a world stalked by plague and peril, widowhood was not a remote possibility. It was a common chapter in the book of life. For a woman, becoming a widow brought a strange and contradictory change in status. On the one hand, she was in a vulnerable position, having lost her provider and protector. On the other hand, for the first time in her life, she might have a degree of legal and economic independence. A widow was entitled to her dower, which was different from her dowry. The dower was a portion of her deceased husband's property, traditionally 1/3 that was meant to support her for the rest of her life. This gave her an income and a place to live. A wealthy widow, controlling her own dower lands and her original dowry, could be a very powerful figure. She could manage her own affairs, make contracts, and decide her own future. However, this newfound freedom was often precarious. A wealthy, childless widow was a prime target on the marriage market. Her wealth made her an incredibly attractive prize for ambitious men. She might face immense pressure from her own family or from the local lord to remarry. There are many recorded instances of powerful widows being abducted and forcibly married by men seeking to gain control of their fortunes. Let us imagine our young noblewoman, Isabel, again. She was married at 12. By 14, her much older husband has died of a fever. She is now the dowager countess of a vast estate. She is also a teenager, alone in a world of powerful, grasping men. Suitors immediately begin to circle. Her father, seeing another opportunity for a strategic alliance, might have her betrothed again before she has even finished mourning. Her brief taste of independence is over. She is once again a piece on the great chessboard of dynastic politics. For a peasant widow, the pressures were more about survival. A widow with young children and a farm to run would find it nearly impossible to manage alone. Remarriage was often a necessity, a way to bring a man's labor back into the household to ensure she and her children did not starve. Whether noble or peasant, a woman's life was defined by her relationships to men, first as a daughter under the authority of her father, then as a wife under the authority of her husband. Only in the brief, often perilous state of widowhood did she have a chance to exercise power in her own right, a fleeting autonomy in a world built to contain her. As the last of our imaginary candlelight sputters and fades, the world of the 14th century recedes into the soft darkness. The calculating voices of fathers and the rustle of marriage contracts grow quiet. The faces in the portraits blur, and the great stone halls dissolve into the mists of time. We leave behind this world of dusty dowries and dutiful daughters, of fates sealed over ale and destinies woven from land and lineage. It was a world governed by a logic that can seem cold and alien to our own. Yet, within its rigid framework, people lived, breathed, and found ways to endure. They built families, navigated hardship, celebrated harvests, and found moments of quiet joy. And sometimes, if they were very fortunate, they found a gentle, resilient love that grew in the space between duty and devotion, a quiet warmth by the hearth of a shared life. Now, let the deep quiet of the past be your comfort. Let these stories of a time long ago serve as a gentle reminder of the enduring human quest for security, connection, and a place to belong. As the echoes of their world fade completely, allow your own mind to become still and clear. Feel the comforting weight of your body, safe and supported. Let your breath continue its slow, steady rhythm, a gentle tide carrying you out into the calm, deep ocean of sleep. There is nothing more for you to do, nothing to solve. Simply let go and drift. Sleep better. Learn more. Forget the noise. Good night. Hello, and welcome once more. Find that place of perfect comfort, where your body can be at ease and your mind can be free to wander. Let the day's concerns drift away like dust motes in a sunbeam. Perhaps you can hear the gentle hum of a fan, a modern whisper that we can imagine is the sound of a warm prairie wind. Tonight, we will journey through time and space, leaving our world behind to step into another. We are traveling to the American West of the 1870s. But we are not visiting the West of cinematic legenda, land of righteous heroes in clean hats and villains in black. We are going to the real West, a place of staggering beauty and unimaginable hardship, of profound loneliness and fierce community, a place where the line between survival and oblivion was redrawn with every rising sun. I often wonder where these stories find each of you, our quiet fellowship of listeners connected by a shared curiosity. It's a lovely thought, a silent map of minds all turning towards the past together. Now, take a slow, deep breath, and another. Let the sounds of your world recede. In their place, let us conjure the vast, enveloping silence of a world before engines, a silence punctuated only by the cry of a hawk, the rustle of unseen creatures in the tall grass, or the distant, mournful whistle of a lone steam train cutting through the night. Let us ease into this journey. We are going to explore, in intimate detail, why you, a citizen of the 21st century, would find the untamed American frontier to be the most formidable challenge of your life. Congratulations, you have woken up. The year is 1875. You are lying not in your comfortable bed, but on a crude rope-strung frame supporting a canvas sack. This mattress is filled with lumpy, rustling straw or dried corn husks that have been packed down by the weight of your own exhausted body. And you are not alone. It is crawling with uninvited guests, fleas, lice, and the ever-present bed bugs that leave itchy red welts on your skin. Before your eyes even open, the first assault begins. The smell. It is a physical presence in the air, a thick, complex miasma. There is the pungent, animalistic odor of unwashed human bodies. Bathing, you see, is a monumental chore, not a daily pleasure. It involves hauling and heating gallons of precious water, a resource too valuable to be wasted on hygiene. A full body wash is a rare, seasonal event. The rest of the time, you make do with a quick wipe from a damp rag. This is layered with the sharp, acidic tang of the chamber pot, tucked in a corner, and the stale odor of last night's cooking greasy salt pork and boiled beans. Now, let's consider your shelter. If you are on the treeless Great Plains, you likely live in a soddy, a house built from the very earth itself. To construct it, you or your family would have spent weeks cutting dense bricks of prairie sod, held together by a thick tangle of grass roots, and stacking them like giant, earthy bricks. The roof is made of interwoven branches or planks, covered with more sod, grass side up. From the outside, it looks almost picturesque, blending into the landscape. Inside, it is a dark, damp, and claustrophobic space. The single small window, perhaps covered with a greased paper pane, lets in only a sliver of light. The walls are alive. Centipedes, spiders, and field mice make their homes in the packed earth. During a rainstorm, the roof doesn't just leak. It melts, dripping a slow, steady rain of mud and worms onto everything and everyone below. In the dry season, the walls shed a constant fine dust of dirt that coats your food, your bedding, and the inside of your lungs. It is a home that is never truly clean or dry. You swing your legs out of bed and your feet hit the cold, packed dirt floor. A deep, gnawing ache radiates from every joint and muscle. This is not the satisfying soreness of a good workout. It is the grinding fatigue of relentless, back-breaking labor. Life here is a 14 to 16-hour workday, 7 days a week. There is no concept of a weekend, a holiday, or retirement. Your body is your only machine. As a man, you might spend your day behind a plow, fighting to turn the stubborn, root-choked sod, a task so strenuous it could cripple a man in a few seasons. As a woman, your labor is just as demanding, a ceaseless cycle of hauling water, tending a garden, preserving food, washing clothes by hand with harsh lye soap, and caring for children, all while likely pregnant or nursing. By the age of 35, many frontier folk were stooped and arthritic, their bodies worn out. The average life expectancy was not a statistical abstraction. It was a visible reality in the faces of your neighbors. The chill in the air is sharp. If it is winter, the temperature inside your soddy or log cabin can easily drop below freezing. A small cast iron stove is your only source of heat, but fuel is a constant concern. On the plains, wood is scarcer than gold. Families spend hours gathering prairie coal, dried buffalo, or cow manure, which burns with a hot but acrid smoky fire. If it is summer, the small space becomes an oven, with the sun beating down on the dark earth roof. making the air thick and suffocating. There is no escape from the elements. Your clothing offers little comfort. You own perhaps 2 outfits. The cloth is coarse wool or canvas that chafes your skin. For a woman, the layers are suffocating chemise, corset, petticoats, and a heavy dress. The corset, whaleboned and tightly laced, is not a fashion accessory but considered a medical necessity for posture and organ support. In reality, it restricts breathing and can, over years, permanently deform the rib cage. Everything you wear is functional, durable, and almost always dirty. Your stomach growls, a hollow, aching feeling. It is time for breakfast, the fuel for another day of toil. You hope for something, anything, different, but you know what to expect. The frontier diet was a grim cycle of monotony. The foundation was built on foods that were cheap, calorie-dense, and non-perishable. Heavily salted pork, salt pork or bacon, beans, and some form of bread, usually dense, hard biscuits or cornbread. The salt pork was preserved in barrels of brine and was so salty it had to be soaked for hours, sometimes a full day, to be rendered even remotely edible. Even then, it was often rancid. Fresh vegetables and fruits were a fleeting, seasonal dream. For a few months in the summer, a well-tended garden might provide some relief. But for the long winter and spring months, there was nothing fresh at all. This led to chronic, debilitating nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy was the most feared, a slow, painful decay of the body's connective tissues from a lack of vitamin C. Your gums would swell and bleed. Your teeth would loosen. Your joints would ache, and you would be overcome by a profound lethargy. Pellagra, from a niacin deficiency common in corn-based diets, caused the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. The preservation of food was not a hobby. It was a matter of life and death. Women spent the short harvest season in a frenzy of canning, pickling, and drying. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar. Fruits were dried or made into sugary preserves, though sugar itself was an expensive, treasured luxury. Root vegetables were stored in a root cellar, a dark, underground pit that might keep them from freezing but not from rot or pests. Your stored food was under constant assault from rats, mice, and weevils. It was simply accepted that your flour would have insect parts in it. And then there is the coffee. The iconic image of the cowboy with his tin cup and steaming coffee pot is powerful, but the reality was grim. The coffee beans were cheap, low grade, and often bought green. You would roast them yourself in a skillet over the fire, a process that almost always resulted in scorching them. To stretch the precious supply and to help the grounds settle in the pot, you would add fillers. Some used eggshells. Cowboys on the trail were known to use a piece of salted fish skin. The coffee was then boiled, and often reboiled with new grounds added to the old, for hours. The result was a bitter, acidic, gritty sludge. It was less a beverage of pleasure and more a crude caffeine delivery system, a necessary jolt to animate an exhausted body. You would drink it, chew the grounds, and try to feel grateful for the warmth. Before stepping out into the world, you perform the morning ritual of shaking out your boots. A scorpion, a centipede, or even a small rattlesnake seeking warmth could have crawled inside during the night. A venomous bite out here, dozens or even hundreds of miles from a doctor, was a death sentence delivered in a matter of hours. Let us imagine you need to travel, not a commute to an office, but a journey to the next town for supplies, or the epic, life-altering trek west on an emigrant trail. Travel was not an inconvenience. It was a gamble with your life. If you are fortunate enough to own a horse, you are in the minority. A good horse could cost several months' wages, but riding was no pleasure cruise. The saddles of the 1870s were designed for function, not comfort. and hours of riding would leave even an experienced horseman with painful blisters and raw sores. A sudden noise, a snake in the grass, could spook your horse, throwing you to the ground. A broken bone in the wilderness, with no way to set it properly, could lead to a permanent, crippling disability or a fatal infection. Most families traveled by wagon. The image of the white-canvased prairie schooner is iconic, but the experience was brutal. The wagon was an unsprung wooden box on wheels. Every rock and rut in the trail sent a violent jolt through the entire vehicle. The constant jarring motion caused a form of seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable for weeks on end. The roads were often just the faint tracks of previous wagons. After a rain, they became quagmires of thick, sticky mud that could suck a wagon down to its axles. During dry spells, the dust kicked up by the oxen and wheels was so thick it was like a suffocating blanket, coating your lungs, eyes, and food. Now, picture yourself on the Oregon Trail, a 2-0-mile odyssey. This journey was one of the great migrations in human history, but its human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that up to 10% of those who started the journey died along the way. The trail was, in effect, a 2-0-mile-long graveyard. The number one killer was disease, specifically cholera. Its speed was what made it so terrifying. A person could be healthy at dawn and buried by dusk. Wagon trains, which were essentially mobile villages, were perfect incubators for the disease, which spread through water contaminated by human waste. When an outbreak hit, panic would ensue. Families were forced to abandon their sick, to die alone on the prairie, or to bury their dead in shallow, hasty graves, piling stones on top to deter wolves before moving on. The relentless pressure to cross the mountains before the winter snows meant there was no time for proper burials, no time for grief. River crossings were another point of extreme peril. Major rivers like the North Platte or the Snake had no bridges. Pioneers would have to caulk their wagon beds to make them semi-waterproof and then float them across, a process fraught with danger. A sudden current, a panicked ox, or an unbalanced load could flip a wagon in an instant, drowning its occupants and sending a family's entire worldly possessions to the bottom of the river. And then there was the psychological toll. The sheer monotony of the journey, walking day after day across a seemingly endless, featureless landscape, was mentally crushing. This was punctuated by moments of sheer terror. A lightning storm on the open prairie, a prairie fire moving faster than a horse can run, or a stampede of the draft animals. The constant stress, the grief of losing loved ones, the physical exhaustion drove many to despair. The infamous story of the Donner Party, trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada and forced to resort to cannibalism to survive, is the most extreme example, but it highlights the desperate lengths to which people were driven. If you survive the journey and arrive in a frontier town, you might feel a wave of relief. Here are buildings, people, a semblance of civilization. But this is a paradox. In many ways, the town concentrates the dangers. The layout is haphazard, a collection of wooden buildings thrown up quickly to serve a transient population of miners, cowboys, or railroad workers. The streets are thick with a slurry of mud and manure. The smell you encountered in your cabin is now amplified 100-fold. With no public sanitation, human and animal waste, along with garbage, is simply thrown into the streets or back alleys. Swarms of flies are a constant presence, moving from filth to food, making the town a perfect breeding ground for typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses. You see the general store, the town's economic and social heart. You step inside, and the prices shock you. Everything has to be hauled by wagon or rail from the east, and the transportation costs are enormous. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of a full day's wages. Here, you see the reality of frontier isolation. Mail arrives infrequently. A newspaper might be weeks or months out of date. You could go years without hearing from family back east. For many, the move west was a final farewell. The psychological toll of this profound isolation was immense, contributing to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide. You then pass the saloon, often the first and most profitable business in any new town. Forget the Hollywood image of swinging doors, a polished bar, and a charming piano player. The reality was often a dark, smelly, one-room affair with a plank over 2 barrels for a bar. The main commodity was cheap, potent, and often adulterated alcohol. This rot-gut whiskey was sometimes mixed with tobacco juice for color, cayenne pepper for a hot kick, or even turpentine. It was designed for maximum intoxication at minimal cost. This combination of cheap, powerful alcohol and a population of young, single, armed, and often frustrated men was a recipe for violence. But the iconic quick-draw duel in the middle of the street is almost entirely a myth, an invention of dime novels. Real frontier violence was sudden, brutal, and ugly. It was a drunken argument that escalated, a knife pulled in a dark alley, a dispute over a mining claim settled with a shotgun blast to the back. It was impulsive, messy, and devoid of honor. Your last stop might be the doctor's or dentist's office. Medical knowledge was shockingly primitive. Germ theory was still being debated. A doctor might perform an amputation on a kitchen table, wiping his saw and his pants between procedures. Without antibiotics, any deep wound was potentially fatal. Common treatments sound like torture today. Bloodletting to balance the humors, powerful purgatives to cleanse the system, and the liberal prescription of mercury compounds, which are neurotoxins. Dentistry was even more terrifying. There were no fillings, no root canals. The only solution for a painful tooth was extraction, performed without anesthetic, with tools that resembled a blacksmith's pliers. In this lawless land, how was order maintained? The reality was a complex patchwork of formal law, community pressure, and brutal, informal justice. In vast rural areas, a single county sheriff might be responsible for a territory the size of a modern state. He was not a gunslinging hero, but an overworked public servant whose main duties were collecting taxes and serving legal papers. He relied on deputizing ordinary citizens into a posse to chase down criminals, a highly inefficient and often dangerous system. In many places, especially in the early days of a mining camp or settlement, there was no formal law at all. Justice was handled by vigilante groups. These vigilance committees were formed by the leading citizens of a town to deal with perceived threats, like horse thieves and murderers. Sometimes, they provided a semblance of order where none existed, but they could just as easily become instruments of mob rule, prejudice, and personal vendetta. A man accused of horse theft, a capital crime on the frontier, where a horse meant survival, might be given a trial that lasted 5 minutes before being lynched from the nearest tree. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was a luxury many frontier communities could not, or would not, afford. The famous lawmen of the era, like Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok, were complex and morally ambiguous figures. They were often gamblers, saloon owners, and part-time lawmen who moved between both sides of the law as it suited them. Their legends were greatly embellished by dime novelists who transformed them into paragons of virtue. Wild Bill Hickok, for instance, a man of considerable skill with a pistol, accidentally shot and killed his own deputy in a chaotic shootout in Abilene. Wyatt Earp's famous gunfight at the OK Corral was seen by many at the time not as a heroic act, but as a controversial and bloody vendetta. The outlaws were equally mythologized. Figures like Jesse James were portrayed as Robin Hood-like figures, stealing from the rich banks and railroads. and fighting for the common man. The reality was that James was a ruthless killer and a product of the brutal guerrilla warfare of the Civil War in Missouri, whose gang terrorized communities and murdered innocent people during their robberies. Let's assume you need to make a living. The frontier offered several paths, all of them paved with hardship and danger. Mining. The dream of striking it rich drew hundreds of thousands west. But the image of the lucky prospector finding a nugget the size of his fist is a lottery winner's fantasy. By the 1870s, the easily accessible placer gold in streams had been largely played out. Mining was now an industrial enterprise. You would most likely be a wage laborer for a large corporation. The work was unimaginably dangerous. You would work a 10 or 12-hour shift in a dark, poorly ventilated shaft, breathing in fine rock dust that caused silicosis, a disease that slowly suffocated you. You might use mercury to amalgamate with the gold, absorbing the toxic metal through your skin, leading to tremors, insanity, and death. Cave-ins were common. Blasting with unstable dynamite was a constant hazard. For this, you would earn $2 or $3 a day, much of which you would be forced to spend at the company-owned store, which charged inflated prices and kept you in a cycle of perpetual debt. Ranching and the cowboy. The life of a cowboy has been romanticized more than any other. In reality, it was the life of a young, poorly paid, migratory agricultural laborer. The great cattle drives were not romantic adventures. They were months of grueling work, 20 hours a day in the saddle, in all weather conditions. The diet was monotonous beans and salt pork. The danger was constant. A stampede, which could be triggered by a simple thunderclap, could turn thousands of half-ton animals into an unstoppable trampling force of death. The cowboy's life was one of low pay, immense physical hardship, and periods of intense loneliness, punctuated by brief, explosive visits to cattle towns. Farming the homestead. The Homestead Act of 1862 seemed like a dream. 160 acres of free land. But on the arid plains, 160 acres was often not enough to support a family. The first task was breaking the sod, a task so physically demanding it was said to have broken men's hearts. The prairie sod was a dense mattress of roots that had been growing for millennia. Once the crops were planted, you faced a litany of biblical-scale threats. Drought could wither your entire crop in the field. A sudden hailstorm could pound it into the dirt in minutes. And then there were the grasshoppers. They would descend in swarms so thick they blotted out the sun, with a sound like a roaring fire. They would eat everything green, and when that was gone, they would eat the clothes off your back, the leather harnesses of your animals, and even the wooden handles of your tools. The isolation of farm life was profound and led to a condition known as prairie madness, a deep depression that drove some to suicide. The American West was one of the most multicultural places on Earth, but it was not a harmonious melting pot. It was a place of rigid social hierarchies and frequent racial violence. We have spoken of the catastrophic impact on Native Americans. Let us revisit this with clarity. The destruction of the buffalo was a deliberate policy of ecological and cultural warfare. The reservation system was designed to concentrate and control populations, often on the least desirable land. The boarding schools were instruments of forced assimilation, designed to systematically destroy language, religion, and family structures. The violence was not a war between two sides. It was a conquest marked by massacres of women and children, such as the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado or the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. Women, as we've seen, were the backbone of the frontier, yet legally they were often little more than property. However, the unique conditions of the West did create opportunities. The scarcity of women in many territories gave them a certain social power and leverage, And it was in the West that the movement for women's suffrage won its first victories. Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote in 1869, followed by Utah in 1870, decades before the rest of the country. The contributions of immigrant and minority groups were essential, yet they were consistently met with discrimination. Chinese immigrants, after building the railroad, were driven out of mining camps by violent mobs and targeted by discriminatory laws like the foreign miners' tax. They built their own resilient communities, Chinatowns, but were often scapegoats during economic downturns. Mexican Americans, many of whom were residents of the Southwest long before it was part of the United States, saw their land grants, guaranteed by treaty, stolen through complex legal maneuvering by Anglo lawyers and land speculators. Their traditional systems of communal land use and water rights clashed with the American obsession with private property and fences. Black Americans made up a huge portion of the frontier population, particularly among cowboys. Figures like Nat Love and Bill Pickett became legendary horsemen and ropers, yet their stories were largely whitewashed out of the popular cowboy myth. Black homesteaders established all-black towns, like Nicodemus, Kansas, seeking a refuge from the terror of the Jim Crow South, but still faced prejudice and economic hardship. As the 1880s gave way to the 1890s, the West was changing. The very things that made it wild were disappearing. Barbed wire, invented in 1874, carved up the open range, ending the era of the great cattle drives. The railroads brought a flood of settlers and mass-produced goods, connecting even remote towns to the industrial East. The buffalo were gone. Most Native American tribes had been confined to reservations. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed. This announcement sent a shockwave through the American psyche. For a century, the frontier had been a safety valve, a place of opportunity, a core part of the national identity. Now, it was gone. And precisely at this moment of its death, the romantic myth of the Wild West was born. Nostalgia for a rugged past took hold in an increasingly urban, industrial America. Entertainers like Buffalo Bill Cody created spectacular Wild West shows that were part circus, part historical reenactment. These shows, with their staged Indian attacks and feats of marksmanship, presented a simplified, heroic version of the West that thrilled audiences in New York, London, and Paris. Cheap dime novels, written by authors in the East, created the iconic character of the noble, quick-drawing cowboy who always triumphed over evil. Later, the fledgling film industry seized upon these myths, creating the Western movie genre. The lone cowboy, a figure of pure virtue and rugged individualism, became a potent symbol of American character. These myths were powerful because they were reassuring. They told a story of a clear, moral triumph of civilization over savagery, of progress over primitivism. They justified westward expansion as a noble destiny rather than a complex and often brutal conquest. What these myths erased was the grit, the pain, the complexity, and the diversity of the real West. They erased the smell, the disease, the grinding labor. They erased the stories of the women, the immigrants, the Native Americans. They replaced a difficult, morally ambiguous history with a simple, satisfying bedtime story. And now, our time in the past is over. Let the dust of the 1870s settle. Allow the sounds and sensations of that harsh and beautiful world to recede. Feel yourself returning fully to the present moment, to the safety and comfort of your own space, your own bed. You have walked for a time in the footsteps of those who lived on the frontier. You understand now that their survival depended not on quick-draw heroics, but on an almost unimaginable capacity for endurance, ingenuity, and community. The true story of the West is not one of lone heroes, but of families and diverse peoples struggling together against overwhelming odds. It is a story of human resilience in the face of constant hardship, and of the profound human cost of building a nation. As you close your eyes and prepare for sleep, hold on to a final image, not of a gunfight, but of the vast, silent prairie at night, under a dome of stars so brilliant they seem almost close enough to touch. This was a beauty and a quiet that everyone on the frontier shared, a moment of sublime connection to the universe that perhaps gave them the strength to face another day. The people who looked up at those same stars are long gone, but their legacy, stripped of myth, is a testament to the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. Let that profound human story be your companion as you drift into a peaceful, restful sleep. Sleep well.